Yes. Hello, everybody. It's Joe again. Thank you for coming. Hi, Dolores. Hi, Kay. Hi, Deborah. Nice to see you. Hi, Carmen. Nice to see you. Hi, Rick Maynard. Good to see you. Steve Wolfbrand, is there a doctor in the house? Depends on what kind of doctor you mean. Rick said almost hurt someone. Steve Day smiles. And Rick says, finally, some time off from phone banking. I guess you've been working real hard, Rick, right? Steve Day says, hang on. And Dolores says, sharing. Thank you for sharing, Dolores. Carmen says, hi, Stoner. Carmen says, for who? Rick says, hi, Joe. Good to see you, too. Thank you, Rick. Okay, so is a choice. We're seeing a choice get increasingly intense, crop up and getting increasingly intense. Specifically, it's the choice between passing a coronavirus relief or stimulus bill, if you want to call it that, versus going all out to confirm Amy Coney Barrett So Dave Dayen yesterday had a pretty good column on the choice, saying Republicans must choose between stimulus or their Supreme Court power grab. And there's a picture I'm sharing of Amy Coney Barrett making gestures with Steve Daines listening. Probably Amy Coney Barrett is talking. And Steve Daines, of course, is running to be reelected to the Senate in Montana. And right now, his competition, Stephen Bullock, has been going ahead in the polls. For a long time, Steve Daines was ahead. He's the incumbent. Steve Bullock, the governor, was behind, but he's now caught up. Why is he caught up? Because the Republicans are blocking relief and people are angry. And Dave points out we've been whipsawed from the cancellation of talks on stimulus before the election to talks resuming within 48 hours. President Trump, high on steroids, has furiously backpedaled from his initial announcement, and Politico's Jake Sherman touts that the White House, quote, is now completely set on striking a stimulus deal, unquote. So Trump must have realized that Mitch McConnell was not his friend, and that Mitch McConnell did not have the same aims as Donald Trump, which is, of course, another 4 years for Donald Trump. But Sherman's throw-in line, quote, no guarantees it goes anywhere in the Senate, unquote, kind of nullifies the whole thing, doesn't it? Dave says, even if I believed that Trump would agree to work with Nancy Pelosi, who was publicly floating a bill to have the presidency stripped from him due to lack of mental competency, why am I to believe that Mitch McConnell is involved with or interested in this in any way? Indeed, McConnell is out this morning calling hopes for a deal, quote, unlikely, unquote. Nothing has changed this week for McConnell, who hasn't been at the White House in 2 months. Probably a wise man not to go anywhere near the White House. He didn't go near the White House, and he wasn't one of those who got COVID at the super spreader event. And McConnell told Trump by phone days ago that he couldn't pass any deals struck between Pelosi and Stephen Mnuchin through the Senate. His members still are wary of large fiscal spending, and if he passes a bill with mostly Democrats, that would be the one thing that could possibly get him in trouble with his own re-election in a few weeks. So, this opens up, I'm no longer going through the article, doing some commentary here. This suggests that maybe Amy McGrath, the Democrats' Amy, should suddenly begin running her election campaign on the claim that Mitch McConnell is what's standing in the way for everybody in Kentucky getting $1,200 stimulus checks and all the unemployed workers in Kentucky getting extra and enhanced unemployment check. Either $600 a week or $500 a week or $400 a week. We don't know what they're going to settle on yet. The administration is still holding out for $400 a week. I think that's stupid politics on the part of the administration. But they've been playing stupid politics right along here. If they had pressured the Senate and Mitch McConnell in July to take up the HEROES Act and do some kind of compromise on it, it could have been passed then, and the Republicans wouldn't be in the pickle that they are now, because they really are in a pickle. Democratic leads in swing states or surges in swing states starting to give Democrats the small leads in some, large leads, okay, in others. Those leads are there because the Republicans are totally resisting doing anything for people. And Trump has been resisting doing anything for people. And he's still trying to resist on the theory that if he resists what Nancy Pelosi wants just a little, that's going to have some effect on the Republicans in the Senate and make them more likely to vote for some compromise bill. I don't believe that's true. I think that's stupid. I think what Trump ought to do from his point of view, for his own benefit, is go big or go home. In other words, make an agreement with Nancy Pelosi that is palatable to her. It will be palatable to Trump because the larger the checks, the larger the unemployment checks, and the larger the stimulus checks, the better not only Nancy Pelosi will look, but Trump will look on November 3rd. So he shouldn't be trying to make things palatable to the Republicans. What he should do is go to the Senate and whipsaw some of the swing state Republicans who have no choice but to follow him because they're in tight races to vote along with what he wants, specifically the stimulus bill, or the stimulus deal he strikes with Nancy Pelosi. Even if there are only 10 Republican senators who desert the party and who go over, that's going to help him in his re-election campaign. But he's been playing it real stupid. He moved up to $1.8 trillion, so he's gotten close to Nancy Pelosi, but he just can't bring himself to go all the way and just accept what he has to offer. He's going to claim credit for it anyway, right? So what's the difference? Is he going to do better if he claims credit for a $1.9 trillion deal than he would do if he claims credit for a $2.2 trillion deal? I think he'd do better claiming credit for the $2.2 trillion deal. So he just ought to do it. It would do even better for him if he countered with a $2.6 trillion deal with another round of stimulus checks for people. 2 rounds of stimulus checks. Not 1 round of stimulus checks. 2 rounds. 1 right now and 1 in December. And write that into law. That would be the best for him on November 3rd. I don't know why I'm trying to give him ideas. I don't want him to win. But at the same time, he's playing it stupid. It's just plain stupid. Anyway, if he could get all the Democrats and 10 Republican senators, there'd be no problem getting the bill passed. No problem getting the bill passed. If he needed 15 Republican senators, he could get that. There are enough Republicans on the bubble now. They got to go along with him. And there are only about 20 diehard, extreme right-wing senators anyway. He could probably get as many as 30 Republican senators to go along with him if he really pressed. Instead of having meetings on the White House lawns with crowds pressed together, and maybe he can have a meeting on the White House lawn with 30 Republican senators where he explains to them why it's in their interest to vote for that kind of compromise. Anyway, that's not what we're seeing. Anyway, Mitch McConnell's members are still wary of large fiscal spending. And if he passes a bill that with mostly Democrats, Dave is saying that's the one thing that could possibly get him in trouble. But, of course, Amy McGrath should be running in Kentucky on the idea that Mitch McConnell is standing in the way. And, of course, the more she emphasizes that idea, the less likely it is that Mitch McConnell is going to hold out. All the national election indicators still point, to McConnell playing for 2022 rather than 2020. Sure, there's only one way to make him play for 2020, and that is if Amy McGrath starts getting real close to him, and she's not going to get real close to him until she starts attacking him for the absence of a relief bill in Kentucky. Dave says, heck, Trump's erratic behavior has the party on the verge of losing Kansas, Missouri, and Montana. And a lot more than that, according to internal polling, to say nothing of Arizona, Texas, and Georgia. And more. And more. And McConnell likely doesn't think a stimulus bill will revive electoral fortunes, though it may give a runaway to President Biden, and that would not please the Senate Majority Leader. You would maybe see McConnell agreeing to certain targeted relief as long as it was targeted at the corporate sector. But Pelosi rejected a standalone airline package even after readying the legislation last week. He's still pressing for a comprehensive deal, but that's where McConnell and his caucus have consistently drawn the line for months. Even the $1.6 trillion White House offer from a week ago includes measures that I think that Mitch McConnell would have no interest in passing, including $250 billion in a blue state bailout. I believe in the latest $1.8 trillion offer, the White House has come up to $400 billion for state and local governments. Now he's talking a little bit from Nancy Pelosi's point of view. While Trump is done with this, his quote, save my re-election, quote, unquote, lunge, is a couple of things. First, it's operated as a stock pumping scheme, says Dave. Trump was worried about the reaction of the market to his calling off the talks, but just the resumption has put Wall Street on track for its best week since August. If you keep talking about stimulus without actually doing it, investor expectations grow, and the market goes up. I don't know if there's a dump to this pump and dump scheme, but this is what the pump looks like. But Trump has fumbled his way into handing Senate Democrats an excellent closing argument. The question every Republican needs to answer now is this: who should get priority from Republicans? Amy Coney Barrett or millions of unemployed and suffering Americans? The answer should be obvious to anyone who's the slightest bit sane. Senator McConnell has 2 weeks left in the Senate calendar before the election, and he wants to spend that time on the Barrett confirmation. There's a world where a stimulus bill is ready on the 19th and dispensed with before Barrett hits the Senate floor on the 26th. But that presumes a very quick agreement on the top lines. It'll take a week to translate that into legislative language and the creation of a bill that Senator McConnell and the Republicans actually want to pass. More likely, if the Pelosi-Mnuchin talks bear fruit, is a situation with limited floor time and Senate Republicans with 2 options. I think this is a real good analysis on Dave's part. Plow forward with Barrett or pass the stimulus. That's a fight that Democrats can win big politically, even if they can't get Mitch McConnell to alter his course. Dave says, I could see Barrett herself being asked this question in confirmation hearings. Who do you think is more important, you or the 2.4 million Americans and rising that have been unemployed for more than 27 weeks? I thought the number was now 4.1 million Americans, but I may be mistaken about that. I thought we found that out on Thursday. Anyway, Trump should be asked the question as well, as should every Republican. Should economic stimulus come first or confirming a Supreme Court justice? Everyone from the local door catcher to the president should be forced to choose between their generational stamp on the high court and aid for the American people. I see no evidence to alter my initial conclusion that time and Mitch McConnell will prevent the people from getting that aid. But there remains political value in laying bare GOP priorities. There does, a lot of political value. That is political value sufficient to deliver a Senate majority high enough to support an effort on the part of the Democrats to pack the court themselves. That is an effort that I would devoutly like to see. Okay, I hope you've been sharing. I'm moving now to the discussion of Amy Coney Barrett herself. I don't think I did that right. So let me see what I got here. Oh, there we go. Common Dreams had an article by Bill Moyers and Lisa Graves. It's actually the transcript, okay, of an interview. Actually, transcript of a podcast. Will Amy Coney Barrett stand by her man? He's betting a second term on it. And this is by Bill Moyers and Lisa Graves. And who they? Well, in case you didn't know, Bill Moyers has been around since the Johnson administration. He's a veteran journalist, broadcaster, an author, a former managing editor of Myers & Company and BillMoyers.com. His previous shows on PBS included Now with Bill Moyers and the Bill Moyers Journal. Over the past 3.5 decades, he's become an icon of American journalism and is the author of many books. I won't go over the books, but he was one of the organizers of the Peace Corps, a special assistant for Lyndon Baines Johnson, a publisher of Newsday, senior correspondent for CBS News, and he's been a progressive for many, many, many years, and he still is. He has never changed his spots or his color. He has 30 Emmys, 9 Peabodys, 3 George Polk Awards, and you can follow him on Twitter at Bill Moyers. And Lisa Graves is co-director of Documented, a new investigative watchdog group, the former executive director of the Center for Media and Democracy. She served in that role from 2009 to 2017. She was a Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the U.S. Department of Justice in the Office of Legal Policy Development, and served as Chief Counsel for nominations for the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee for Senator Pat Leahy. You can follow her on Twitter at the Lisa Graves. The Lisa Graves. I guess there must be many Lisa Graves, so she decided to call herself the Lisa Graves. Fair enough, I guess. Anyway, this is an interview, and Bill Moyers said, "Thank you, Lisa, for taking my call." And Lisa said, "My pleasure, Bill. Thank you so much for calling me." They know each other for many years, of course. Bill says, "What exactly does it mean to be the chief counsel to the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee for nominations of federal judges?" She said, "My job was to vet the judicial nominees and the U.S. attorney nominees that were being put forward by President George W. Bush in his first term in office. My job is to review their background, review any information available about them, and make the recommendations about whether they were people who had the demeanor and the temperament and the record of fairness to become a federal judge for a lifetime position on our federal courts. So Lisa Graves has been there, right? And then Bill Moyers asked her, and you also served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General under two Attorneys General, one a Republican, the other a Democrat. Guess she's a centrist, right? And Lisa Graves says that's correct. I was a career Deputy Assistant Attorney General at the U.S. Department of Justice under both Ms. Reno and Mr. Ashcroft. And for the first part of 2001, my job was to aid in the orderly transition of government and to advise Ashcroft in particular on judicial nominations on a relationship with the federal judiciary and the state judiciary. So Bill says, you know the nominating process inside and out, right? Lisa Graves' answer, I do. I both worked in it for several years and have been a student of it for many years before that. Bill says, what do you think of how President Trump and the Republican leader of the Senate, Senator McConnell, are doing in rushing Amy Coney Barrett's nomination to the Senate in just a matter of weeks, if not days? Leading question. Lisa Graves says, I think what's happening with the Senate and with this White House in terms of the Supreme Court is profoundly illegitimate for a number of reasons. First, the election is literally weeks away, not too many weeks either. And this president has said expressly that he wants someone confirmed so that he can have a vote on that court to win the litigation that he and his team are planning to bring to that court. And Graves then says, that's profoundly illegitimate. It is. It's an attempt to fix the decision of the court. It's also the case that President Trump and his campaign team are doing enormous fundraising to try to use this nomination to an independent, I would have put quotes in there, branch of government in order to advance his own partisan political interests and try to push Amy Barrett onto the court really for the next 30 to 40 years. So no matter what happens in terms of his election, Trump's election, if they're successful, he will have placed 3 people on the Supreme Court, 2 of them basically due to vacancies during election years. And as you know, the other part of that story is the just extraordinary hypocrisy of Mitch McConnell, of Senator Lindsey Graham, who hopefully is about to lose his seat as a result of his perfidy and hypocrisy, I added that, of Senator Lindsey Graham, of other senators who stalled a nomination by President Obama for months. Justice Scalia passed away in February of 2016, and the Republicans refused to allow Judge Merrick Garland a hearing for months, even though Judge Garland had been on the bench in the D.C. Circuit for many years and was well regarded as a fair judge. Here you have a nomination that's only been vacant for a week or so, and a rush to push someone through at all costs, and to put someone on the court who I think does have a troubling record. Bill Moyers then asks another leading question, but the Constitution is silent on the issue of when a president who has the power and responsibility of appointing Supreme Court justices should make that appointment. I mean, the fact that it's near an election is a coincidence. So what makes this illegitimate? And Lisa Graves then answers, well, it's certainly the case that the Constitution provides for the power of the president to propose a nomination. It doesn't put any time limit on it. But the fact is that historically it has been the case that the Congress has been reluctant to approve nominations in election years, in part because the notion is that the American people are about to decide the course of the nation. Back in 2016, that Supreme Court seat of Justice Scalia's sat vacant for basically almost an entire year. There was no crisis on the court as a result of the vacancy, and the Republicans expressed no urgency to move a nomination forward. And so in this situation, you have a case where, unlike back in 2016, where you had a president who was elected twice to the presidency, here you have someone who won the election in 2016 without winning the popular vote. You have a president who's been impeached by the House of Representatives. I understand that this Senate did not vote to actually remove him from office, but you have serious allegations that face this president on both foreign and domestic issues about his fitness to be the president of the United States, a decision that the American people will be facing in these coming weeks. And this is no time to rush through an irrevocable decision on the part of this president to put someone on the Supreme Court who is in her late 40s. I have to say here, I must say, that decision is not really an irrevocable decision. I mean, if the Democrats would have control of both houses of Congress and they wanted to impeach Amy Coney Barrett, okay, for whatever reason, they could revoke this particular decision. Just saying. Okay. Anyway, Lisa Graves goes on, and she's been a judge for a very short period of time. I think there are a lot of troubling components, okay, to the nominations process as it's unfolded over these many years. At the beginning of our nation's history, people served on the court only 10, maybe 20 years, due to lifespan of people back then. Also, the notion that people needed to have a really long and established career to have that role. Now you have people who are being appointed and they're serving not just for a decade or two, but for generations. In my lifetime, for the last 52 years, there have been 19 people appointed to the United States Supreme Court. 15 of those nominations have been made by Republican presidents and confirmed. Only 4 of the confirmed justices who've been appointed in my lifetime were appointed by Democrats. And so at one point last week, Senator Mitt Romney said, "You've got to get over the idea of there being a liberal Supreme Court." And I thought, quote, "What liberal Supreme Court?" unquote. We have a court that's been dominated by one party through these appointments. The Republicans have chosen very young people for these positions. And in fact, that was the plan of the Republican appointment of Justice Thomas, who was in his early 40s at the time he was appointed. He's now in his early 70s. Bill Moyer said the Republicans have long treated control of the Supreme Court as a very important political issue, electoral issue, election issue. The Democrats have not. The Republicans have outsmarted the Democrats on the evaluation they place on the political aspects of the Supreme Court. Excuse me. Lisa Graves replies and says, "It is the case that the Republicans have really politicized the court in that way, while they claim that the Democrats have. The court that they complained so much about, the one historically complained about, was the Warren Court. That was led by Chief Justice Earl Warren. And that court, in my view, really did a tremendously valuable job for the country. Because what it actually did was to read the Constitution to apply its terms to ordinary people. So, equal protection of the law." Bill Moyers interrupts and asks, "By what do you mean?" Lisa Graves says, "Using that phrase in our 14th Amendment that people will not be denied equal protection to ensure that Americans could not be segregated in our schools through racial segregation. That was attacked vociferously on the right as an appropriate and outrageous decision. It was following the plain language of the Constitution. The Warren Court ruled that when the Constitution says you have a right to counsel, in the case of Gideon versus Wainwright, that you actually have a right to counsel. And so there were a number of decisions in the 50s and 60s that the right wing, they called themselves conservatives or libertarians, opposed. And in the aftermath of those decisions, the Republicans really began running on a claim with Richard Nixon of supposed law and order. Part of that law and order campaign was about the courts and trying to pack the courts with people who he thought would reverse those rulings that gave meaning to people's rights that were listed and written in the Constitution. See, I thought this background was really important for me to bring to you because so many people have forgotten the historical context of those times and what the Warren Court was trying to do and was largely successful in doing, and how the Republicans reacted to it, how they adopted a plan to try to pack the courts over generations to nullify what the Warren Court had done. And then Ronald Reagan went a measure further. He decided to say that he, through his Attorney General Edwin Meese at the time, was going to have a litmus test about abortion, that he would only appoint someone to the Supreme Court who would overturn Roe v. Wade. With Reagan, there was a specific determination to appoint people basically pretty far to the right at the time. They did manage to get Scalia on the court, and they did manage to put William Rehnquist as Chief Justice on the court, who'd been an advisor to Nixon. And then it was 12 years of real court packing by Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush. And when Clinton came into office in the early 1990s, the path he chose was one to say that litmus test was wrong and that we needed fair judges. And so the effort was articulated as trying to put people of moderation on the court. I personally think it's important to talk to the American people about the courts and what's at stake. I don't think that Lisa Graves is saying here quite everything that could be said. Clinton appointed to the court Stephen Breyer, who certainly has not been a flaming liberal. He's characterized as being on the liberal side because people talk about the courts divided into conservatives, and liberals. But he was nowhere near as liberal as the liberals on the Warren Court were. Nowhere near as liberal. He wasn't even as liberal as people appointed by the Republicans who, after a time, swung over to the left side. There were at least 3 of those who were appointed by Republicans. Homer Blackman, of course, was one. David Souter, was another. And the third was, I forgot. He retired not actually too long ago. I'll think of his name. But he was a wonderful justice. Those 3 turned out to be 3 wonderful justices, and they were appointed by Republicans, not by Democrats. The other Clinton justice was RBG, who of course is viewed as a wonderful liberal. And she was a wonderful progressive and liberal when it came to identity politics. But when it comes to the rights of corporations versus the rights of people, she wasn't so liberal. On economic issues, she wasn't really so liberal. And that's a fact. So Clinton did not appoint people who were flaming liberals. And between Sotomayor and Kagan, who were the 2 justices appointed by Obama, certainly Kagan is not an anti-corporate justice. And Sotomayor, while less of a neoliberal than Kagan, is not exactly a flaming economic liberal either. none of the 4 justices appointed by Democrats have come up to the standards of the Warren Court. They all have been rather centrist, in fact. So the Democrats get into office and they appoint the centrists, and the Republicans get into office and they appoint wingers. And that's why the court has been flowing to the right over all these years. Going on. So the effort was articulated as trying to put people of moderation on the court. I personally think it's important to talk to the American people about the courts and what's at stake, and talk about how people are being put on the courts by the right, by the Republicans, in order to overturn precedent, in order to overturn our rights. I think that that case needs to be made, not just to fight about the courts, but to basically tell the American people quite plainly how important the courts are. In this movement that's underway to overturn those rights, I would say to you, one of the things that came out in an investigation by the Washington Post last May by Robert O'Hara and Sean Sean Boberg was that Leonard Leo, who's been working on helping to pack the courts for almost 2 decades or more now, and Bill Moyer interrupts and says, but tell me who that is. And Lisa Graves says, but Leonard Leo for many years served as the vice president of the Federalist Society, and he's still an advisor to the Federalist Society. He has been the architect for the last few decades of this long-term effort to put far-right judges on the Supreme Court and the federal courts and other courts in order to change the law by changing what the decisions are being issued by those very judges. And he has created basically a big dark money operation that the Washington Post tallied at more than $250 million to influence who gets installed on the Supreme Court. And by the way, 5 justices of the Supreme Court at present, before Amy Coney Barrett, are people who are former or current members of the Federalist Society. So Leonard Leo has done his job very, very well. Amy Coney Barrett would be the 6th member of this one organization, of the Federalist Society. It's like, if you're on the Republican side, it's like it's a requirement to be a member of the Federalist Society, or you can't get appointed to the Supreme Court. Lisa Graves continues, and those people are being chosen from his own lists, and they are having an utterly disproportionate influence on who gets confirmed to the Supreme Court. Leo gave a speech last year to a group called the Council for National Policy, which is made up of fundraisers on the far right. Nice neutral name, Council for National Policy. Fundraisers. They're not for national policy. They're for fundraising. People who are funding this effort to capture our courts, as Senator Sheldon Whitehouse has described it. And in that speech, he said that we, America, and the people in that room were standing on the precipice of what he called the revival of what he described as the, quote, structural constitution, unquote, that would roll back 100 years of precedents in America. That the appointments that Trump was making were designed to do just that, to remove the rights of people to organize in labor unions, the rights of people to petition their government for Social Security and programs that help to protect us from the extremes of our economy, to protect our lives, efforts to protect our environment and protect us from pollution from corporations that aren't restrained or regulated. Excuse me. That was really a shocking speech about the level of judicial activism that, but the right wing is pushing. I'm talking about the speech by Shelton Whitehouse. And this new nomination by President Trump of Amy Coney Barrett is in that mold to try to use the courts to reverse Americans' rights. Yes, people have to understand it's about reversing the rights that people have gained as a result of the application of the 14th Amendment, the plain language of the 14th Amendment to protect people. This not only happened under the Warren Court, but it happened under the Roosevelt courts too. The movement started under the Roosevelt courts and continued under the Truman Court and continued under the Eisenhower Court, which, by the way, who do you think appointed Earl Warren as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court? It was none other than Dwight D. Eisenhower, the Republican. The Warren Court was in part the Warren Court because of a Republican president. Of course, after Goldwater, there were drastic changes in the Republican Party. And Bill Moyers then asks, we learned after Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation some very rich people have put up millions of dollars to, quote, sell, unquote, his nomination to the public. Will those people do the same thing for the Barrett nomination? Lisa Gray says, it's already underway. One of the main groups that Leo has helped to orchestrate is called the Judicial Crisis Network. And it's running ads in swing states where senators are facing close election to try to promote this judge because they don't want the GOP senators failing to support the choice of confirming Amy Coney Barrett, even though the GOP senators are risking their seats by doing that rather than supporting the stimulus bill. That's an important thing to note going on with Lisa Graves. And Leonard Leo is the one who's helping to orchestrate for the campaign to use dark money to put these judges in position to rule on our rights and to remove our rights. I know there are groups on the right and left who spend money on the nominations, but this circumstance is really extraordinary because you have unknown billionaires or multimillionaires who are secretly giving to a group that gives to a group. During Kavanaugh, it was the Wellspring Committee giving to Judicial Crisis Network. Bill Moore says, who's in this judicial network you're talking about? Can you name some names, organizations, individuals, and where's the money coming from? And Lisa Gray says, yes. So the Judicial Crisis Network is formally led by Carrie Severino, along with the assistance of Gary Morris, a longtime political ally of Leonard Leo. Leo is the former vice president of the Federalist Society. He now leads a dark money network along with a guy named Greg, I guess, okay, it's Mueller, or maybe Mueller. He and Leo have a group called CRC Advisors that is devoted to capturing by the U.S. Supreme Court and federal courts as well as state Supreme Courts. Carrie Severino's a former clerk of Justice Thomas, and Gary Marks is someone who's been working on judicial nominations with Leo really for the last 2 decades through all the fights to try to pack the courts. Their funders are unknown. We do know that there was one huge donation to the Wellspring Committee. That huge donation was almost entirely given to Judicial Crisis Network. The JCN spent some of that money and then gave some money to other groups in the network, like the so-called Independent Women's Forum that was created around the Clarence Thomas nomination. That's where they got their start, was in judicial nominations. But who is that original donor? We don't know. There's no disclosure of who that one donor was who spent these millions and millions of dollars to capture the court. Who was that? Who was that donor? Who were those people? Probably the Kochs. And they were boasting about how successful or the Mercers, they were in trying to rally their base, the base of Republicans, to try to come out in the 2018 election. That fight over Kavanaugh actually had the effect of bringing a lot of people out who were progressives and moderates who thought we shouldn't have someone like Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. But the JCN and the Independent Women's Forum and their network, they believe judicial nominations help to motivate the base, because even though they will tell the press and the public this person is a rule of law judge or a law and order judge or a judge who's going to follow precedent, now they're calling Amy Coney Barrett a so-called constitutionalist or original interpretivist in the mold of Justice Scalia. These are all just catchphrases that they try to use. They're not appointing her because they think she'll be fair. She's been chosen because they're convinced she'll be unfair. They're convinced that she will decide in their favor to overturn people's rights on a host of issues. That's why they're investing. They're not investing to get a fair judge. If you're trying to appoint a fair judiciary, you may not put a lot of the political capital in that because it's not seen as a political appointment. Instead, if one party is trying to pack the courts and sees the courts as pawns in their political war, and so they're willing to invest enormous funds in order to get those people in place so they can change the law to advance the agenda of those people who are funding it. On the left or in the middle of what you have is a subset of people who believe courts should be fair and they shouldn't be political partisans. And so you're not going to spend any political capital to talk about that very much or make your case, because they're not seen as partisan. And then you have some of the progressives who have said, no, you've got to stand up to what's happening. This is a total capture and takeover, and it's going to undermine our ability to do almost anything a modern society would do. For example, undermine our ability to have rules that try to mitigate climate change. If this court rules that our federal government cannot pass measures to regulate carbon, it's an existential consequence of who's being put on the court. And we know that people like Charles Koch have been spending big money to try to capture the courts because he wants to have people on the courts who will limit our ability to regulate corporations, yet to regulate him. And we know that Leo and Carrie Severino and their team are trying to put people on the court for that reason, as well as to limit the reproductive rights of women and more. And so you have this confluence on the right where they're choosing people and trying to put them in place because they don't think they'll be fair, because they're convinced that they will rule in their favor, which is the opposite of what you expect from a judge, to be fair and impartial. Now it goes back to Bill Moyers, who says, let me read you what Josh Marshall wrote about this. He's founder and editor-in-chief of TalkingPointsMemo.com and a terrific journalistic watchdog when it comes to the judiciary. He says, and I'm quoting, quote, I don't know a lot about Amy Coney Barrett, but I know she's accepting the nomination from a president actively trying to subvert a national election and threatening to hold on to power by force. An attack on the Constitution unparalleled in American history. Do I need to know more? Said the Josh Marshall. Lisa Graves says, I think he's exactly right. It would be an honor to be nominated to be a Supreme Court justice. But under these circumstances, I think it reveals a lack of devotion to the Constitution to be a willing party to what's upholding. Where you have a president who has said expressly that he wants you on the court in order to rule in his favor in this election to keep him in power. A president who has said expressly that if they can stop the ballots, there will be no transmission. It will just be a continuation of his power. When you have a president that has made lie after lie about some massive voter fraud in America, when in fact the statistics and evidence show that that's not the case, so you have someone who's willing to take such a nomination, to take that baton from this president, I think that is damning in its own way. And Bill Moyer says, is it possible, Lisa, that she doesn't know the fix is in and that she's the fix? Lisa says, anything is possible. I don't think it's probable. The reason I don't think it's probable is because if you look at her decisions as a judge in the very brief time that she's been a judge, as well as her actions before then, you can see someone who has a very agenda-driven view of the law, one in which she has expressly articulated that she doesn't feel bound by precedent. She doesn't believe the Constitution requires judges to follow precedent. In fact, she thinks it does not require judges to follow precedent, which is the definition of being an activist, that you're someone who wants to impose your own views of the law, regardless of the precedent that people are relying on in this country. I don't think that she is unwitting. In this circumstance, you have this election that is happening as we speak. Okay, and there's litigation around the election that is happening as we speak. And a president who has said quite clearly he's going to use the courts to try to win a victory in this election, no matter what the balance say, and to try to stop them from being counted. And you have an attorney general in Bill Barr who's shown time and again that he's more the president's lawyer than acting in the office of the attorney general, though he's using the office of the Attorney General of the United States, advancing the partisan interests of this president and the lies of this president around voting, and has indicated that he's going to aid in those claims by this president. And now you have a judicial nominee who has willingly stepped into this role of potentially being a deciding vote on the Supreme Court in cases that will affect the outcome of this election. And I certainly hope if she has a hearing, which is slated this month, that she will commit unequivocally to recuse herself from any such legal action. I don't believe she will, though. I don't believe she'll commit to recuse to anything. But Bill Moyers, are you suggesting that she is fully aware that she's also a political operative and a political force in this scenario you just outlined? Again, Lisa says, I believe that she is. There's no doubt that she's smart. There are a lot of smart people out there. They're not all fair. There are a lot of people who are more advocates than judges. I think when you look at Amy Coney Barrett's record, what you see is someone who has been groomed for this position. She clerked for one of the very sort of activist right-wing judges on the D.C. Circuit. She then clerked for Justice Scalia, who often wrote his opinions more like he was writing an op-ed column than writing an opinion of the United States Supreme Court. He was determined to move the law, to change the law, to advance his original point of view, although he cloaked it in originalism, but it really managed to be miraculously aligned for the most part with his personal views. And she's also been someone who's been an activist in attacking the Affordable Care Act. She has written and spoken about a lot of these issues in ways that show that she has a very specific point of view. And I don't think she's been on the bench long enough to know that she can actually set aside her personal views. In fact, I think it seems pretty clear from her decisions in the brief time she's been a judge that she has tried to impose a personal point of view on the law. I don't think she's unwitting in this effort. I think she's embraced by the judicial crisis, by Network, by the Leonard Leo operation, by the president, as someone who they think is a sure thing, a sure vote for them and their right-wing agenda. Bill Moore says, there's been a lot of talk about our hardline ideology in the last few days, that she'll be opposed to the reproductive freedom of women, to affirmative action, to voting rights for minorities, to environmental regulations, even worker safety rules. What I've seen of her record suggests she also a very strong bias on behalf of corporate power. The last decision or rule she issued was that workers, gig workers, can't file for a class action lawsuit against their employer. That's going to be a real blow to workers in what is an expanding gig economy. Okay, Lisa says, I think that decision is very troubling. Jeffrey Toobin pointed out in his piece about the impact of the Federalist Society on our courts and on our law, that she is straight from that mold set forth by Lewis Powell before he became a justice of the Supreme Court. He was appointed by Nixon, by the way. Lewis Powell had been a tobacco lawyer. Before he really was widely known as a tobacco lawyer, he was the main person involved in the Richmond schools. It was fighting the effects of Brown versus the Board of Education to get those schools integrated. So you have this tobacco lawyer who represents a segregated school district who was asked by the United States Chamber of Commerce to write a memo about where the law could go, as he wrote a memo which is now known as the Powell Memo, and that memo has basically said that in his view, no one in America had less influence on policy than business people. And they needed to dramatically change that through changing the courts and changing the way businesses fund think tanks at the federal and state level, as well as the way businesses support by universities. And so that Powell blueprint from the early 1970s to really push for courts that were going to be pro-corporation, and I think she very clearly represents that perspective. Her decisions show that she does, but regardless of her background, I think this would be an illegitimate nomination and illegitimate to proceed. It's fundamentally unjust for anyone, no matter their background, to be put on the court under these circumstances with this election pending. I think it's really a disaster for our country for this nomination to be proceeding. Bill Moyer says, do you really think, Lisa, that a Democrat as president would pass up this opportunity to name a Supreme Court justice if he were in the place, or she were in the place that Trump is right now? Well, I don't know that a president would not nominate someone under these circumstances, although typically, there's usually like 30 to 40 days between a vacancy and a nomination to do an FBI background investigation, to do a thorough vetting of a candidate before someone is named to join the court. In this case, it's super accelerated. As you said, there's no constitutional restriction by time from doing so. But I do think that the president's prerogative in naming someone is not the same as that person's of getting confirmed, as we've seen. The Senate's role is to thoroughly examine a nominee's the record and to allow for there to be time for the American people to understand the record of a person who's being chosen for a lifetime job on the court. Is this the best person? Is this the right person? Is this someone who we trust, who we would entrust with our lives, who we believe absolutely without reservation will be fair? This process where the president's named someone this weekend, the nomination will have arrived in the Senate at the very end of September. The Senate is racing to have a hearing in 2 weeks. That hasn't happened in the modern era. Someone has received a hearing that quickly, and that Senator McConnell has vowed to use the rules of the Senate to try to get a vote before the end of October. It's extraordinary, and it's a real railroading of not just this nomination, but of the American people. Bill Moyer says Trump obviously believes that Schumer will be a wedge to help him win a second term, and that's the issue. And Lisa Gray says, I've never seen a president in my time that has disavowed the results of the election before they've even happened. That has basically vowed to try to stop people from voting, who's vowed to unleash tens of thousands of people to go to polling places to try to, in my view, intimidate them, is now doing fundraising to enlist a, quote, army to defend his results in this election. We've never been in a circumstance where we've had a president so unmoored from the law, so reckless in his disregard of the Constitution, and to have that person choosing his own jury in a case that he's determined to bring to this court is outlandish and outrageous. Bill Moyers then asks, tell me what's right and what's wrong about this scenario. Trump keeps repeating that vote by mail is rife with fraud. So Republican lawyers will try to get a large number of mail ballots thrown out after the election as Trump declares himself the winner on the basis of the ballots that had been cast and counted before and on election day. He has refused to commit to leaving office if he loses, and he will challenge those ballots that have not been counted to try to get them thrown out. It's there, and on other procedural points, that he will need to have a majority on the Supreme Court to take his side, including the justice he's putting on the court. So isn't he sending a message to the world that he expects the court and its new nominee to rule for him and nail down a second term? Is that the strategy? And Lisa Graves says, I believe that's precisely the strategy. This president is trying to secure for himself an illegitimate victory in this election. He has said he's going to win on in-person voting, and that any ballots that come in or that are counted afterward are somehow illegitimate, that they have to be thrown out. And he has said quite clearly he's going to take this to the Supreme Court. The court is actually problematic in a number of ways. First of all, you have someone like Justice Thomas, who has expressed personal antipathy toward Joe Biden from his time as the chairman of the Senate, the Judiciary Committee, presiding over the nomination of Thomas. Justice Thomas's wife has been very active in electoral politics and was active during Bush v. Gore and was on the transition team for George Bush. As that case was coming through the court, she then became part of the transition team for the victor. You have a justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts, who advised on the Bush v. Gore case. You have another recently confirmed justice, and Justice Kavanaugh, who was an attorney on one of the original cases that resulted in a decision in Bush v. Gore. Now you have a nominee who also worked on the Bush v. Gore case in Amy Coney Barrett, Bill Moyer. So if she's concerned, 3 members of the 9-member court will have worked to get the Supreme Court to deliver the presidency to George W. Bush. That's correct. 1/3. And you would have a court that has also demonstrably been trying to limit people's voting rights. Justice Roberts was part of the decision to really restrict the power of the Voting Rights Act. So you already have a court that a reasonable person would question whether that court could or would fairly rule in this election, or whether it would again put its thumb on the scale of justice in favor of the party of the president that nominated them, that put them on the bench. And this president saying that he's choosing someone specifically to help him win that 9th vote on that Supreme Court, and someone who also participated in the litigation that resulted in that extraordinary decision that installed George W. Bush as president by stopping the counting of ballots. And once the ballots were counted, the actual count showed that Al Gore would have won the Electoral College and would have been president, but for that intervention by the U.S. Supreme Court. Bill Moyers. We've had 2 of the last 4 presidents who were elected by minority vote. They got the Electoral College, they lost the popular vote, and they turn around and appoint Supreme Court justices who perpetuate the pattern. And Lisa Grace says, yes, it's very troubling. John Roberts and Justice Alito arguably might not have been confirmed had Bush not been the incumbent. By virtue of this decision in Bush v. Gore, Justice Sandra Day O'Connor disavowed and regretted enormously that she had participated in that 5-4 decision, in which the only justices who ruled in favor of Bush were justices appointed by presidents of his political party. Then you had Obama, who had 3 vacancies, including one in February 2016 that could have been filled any time during that entire year, and there would have been plenty of time for people to weigh in and express any reservations they had about Judge Garland. Almost none were expressed because he'd been a judge for a long time and had a reputation for being a fair judge. And that 3rd nomination of Obama was blocked. That meant the Supreme Court was able to have a 5-4 majority of Republican appointees rather than a 5-4 majority of Democratic appointees. And President Trump, who has appointed 2 justices. And that's why right now you have a court that is 5 Republican appointees and 3 Democratic appointees. And they're trying to make it 6 Republican appointees and 3 Democratic appointees. The Republicans have certainly gamed the system, and they're going to come out with a bunch of ads saying how nice Amy Coney Barrett is, or how good of a neighbor she is, or how nice she is as a colleague or as a teacher. There are a lot of nice people. That doesn't mean that they're fair people. that doesn't mean they're people you would trust to decide impartially in a case involving your rights. And in fact, everything we know about this process, from President Trump, from Leonard Leo, from the Federalist Society, from the Judicial Crisis Network that's backing them, is that she's been chosen with the very hope and belief that she won't be fair, that she will rule in their favor. Bill Moyer says her very nomination under these circumstances is going to cast another long shadow on the court's integrity and on Amy Coney Barrett's, quite frankly. You wonder why someone who's on the record for being a person of faith and a moral person wouldn't say, "Thank you, Mr. President, but let's wait a week or two or three, and then we'll both come out better in the judgment of history." Okay, and Lisa Gray says, if you are a person who believes in the integrity of the judiciary, in the independence of the judiciary, if you're someone who believes the court's core power stems from public esteem and regard for it as an independent and fair institution, I really can't see how you could be a willing participant in this sort of railroading of a nomination through the court on the eve of an election. I think a person who had such a high value of the court and in the importance of the courts as an independent tribunal in our country would call herself for this nomination to be delayed until after the people have a chance to say. Bill Moyers, but let me interrupt there if I can. I'm not sure that waiting for the people to speak, so to speak, in an election is an appropriate way to measure the worthiness of a nominee to the Supreme Court. Okay, and Lisa Gray says, well, it's a complicated issue. I don't think we should be in this position in the first place, because I think with an election so close, that a nomination should probably not have been put forward because of the very way in which it is being politicized and will be politicized. And Bill Moyer says, I agree with that, and could affect the outcome of the election one way or the other. Bill Moyer says, let's take an example. The court is scheduled to hear a big health case a week after the election, and conservatives are openly counting on Barrett to help to throw out the entire Affordable Care Act once and for all. Pandemic or no pandemic, they want to get rid of the Affordable Care Act. Should the senators interrogating her at the hearings come right out and ask her stance on that vote? Lisa Gray says, I don't think she'll give an answer, but the issue of the Affordable Care Act is one in which this president has campaigned on trying to destroy it, has attempted to stop it through law and through a number of through executive orders and various machinations to make it harder for the healthcare exchanges to work. And while some are not trying to claim that the decision from the Fifth Circuit that's coming up to the Supreme Court, that people shouldn't be worried about it, I would say that's what the right wing is trying to say to minimize that case. The reality is that it's been teed up for this moment, for the ACA to be overruled, and with it, the provisions that protect people with pre-existing conditions. Now we have millions more Americans who have pre-existing conditions due to this pandemic, and you also have some serious deceptiveness by this president on this point in particular, where after Justice Ginsburg died, and he made a decision to move forward with a nomination, immediately knowing that the Affordable Care Act was going to be an issue, he suddenly issued an executive order claiming that it's the policy of the federal government to protect people with pre-existing conditions. That executive order does not replace the actual statute, if it's overturned. It's a talking point that he and his advisors have cooked up to try to use in this Supreme Court battle, and in this election, to claim that even though he's determined to overturn the Affordable Care Act, that suddenly he now cares about this. They're going to be using that talking point to try to defend this nominee about her determination to overrule the Affordable Care Act. And she, both as a judge and before she was a judge, has attacked the Affordable Care Act. So I think that, as they say, when people tell you who they are, you should believe them. We should believe very much there's someone who's hostile to the Affordable Care Act, that this, the president's hostile to the Affordable Care Act, and that could affect the lives and health of millions and millions of Americans, and it will. And Bill Moyer says, what will you be watching for during the confirmation hearings? And Lisa Gray says, that's a great question. I mean, I myself am sick and tired of these hearings that really are charades. The senator asks a question on the pretext of not revealing a position or prejudging. Lisa Gray says, yeah. The nominee says, bull. but unpleasantly elegant sometimes, but it's bull. Lisa Graves says, yeah, and the public moves on. Okay, and Lisa says it can be very frustrating watching those hearings because these nominees or this president have been so prepared to try to avoid answering any meaningful questions for the American people under the guise that they can't answer or they would be prejudging when in fact they've been chosen on some of these issues because they have in fact prejudged them. What's been happening with this president's nominees on these questions is so deeply troubling because they have refused to commit to the importance of longstanding precedents, including Brown versus Board of Education, a precedent that's been on the books for nearly 70 years in this country. They will not agree that's good precedent. They will only agree that is, quote, the precedent, unquote, which is meaningless when you have a nominee like Amy Coney Barrett who said that precedent, in her view, violates due process. I'm sure we're going to see what some people call kabuki theater or theatrics at that hearing, in which she declaims about her fairness and her impartiality, and therefore she won't discuss any substantive issue about how she might rule, when the reality is that her record about how she favors corporations over individuals, how she favors corporations, including in cases involving discrimination, racial discrimination, LGBTQ discrimination, and more, how her record shows she has an agenda that she is desirous of using that agenda and propelling it forward with the force of law. So I think that when you have someone who wants to impose their personal views as law, in essence by judicial fiat, not through the legislative process, but impose their views and disavows the value of precedent, refuses to say that core bedrock cases like Brown are good precedent that must be followed. I think you have someone who will be behaving disingenuously in a theatrical way to try to deceive the American people. And I might add, in the same way that Gorsuch tried to deceive the American people and did, and in the same way Kavanaugh did as well. And by the way, in the same way Thomas did. If you recall, if you remember back to Thomas calling what was going on, okay, in the committee as, did he refer to it as a high-tech lynching? I don't think it was very high-tech. I don't think it was a lynching either. But Bill Maher here says, would you concede that she might see this in the context of what she said to the commencement at Notre Dame, when she said there was a larger purpose to being a lawyer than being a lawyer, and I'm paraphrasing that it was a way to help to build the kingdom of God, and implying, therefore, there are times when you do justify the means by the ends, and that she actually thinks is a sincere, faithful Christian, that she's helping to build with this man who's anything but virtuous, the kingdom of God, by going on that court under these questionable circumstances so that she can accomplish some of what it takes to build the kingdom of God here on earth. Lisa Graves says, yeah, you know it is the case that we've seen from the Falwell world and other worlds, a real willingness to turn a blind eye to the many ways in which this president has transgressed the basic moral code on a daily basis. I'm not even going to get into the New York Times report about the failing to pay taxes or potential tax fraud, what that means in terms of theft from the Treasury. We have a president who has been more aggressive in violating those moral norms than I think any president possibly since Nixon. Maybe much worse than Nixon. I think it's much worse than Nixon. And you have him embraced by the religious right. Not all people of faith. There are progressive and moderate evangelicals and people from the Catholic faiths who do not embrace this president as a moral leader. But you do have people in this country like Leonard Leo and William Barr and the Judicial Crisis Network that are willing to advance this president's agenda because it helps them win changes in Supreme Court doctrine, including in particular on Roe v. Wade, but also on gay rights, on the rights of LGBTQ Americans, and more. In terms of Amy Coney Barrett, all people are entitled to their faith and to make decisions about their conscience and what their faith means to them and how it enriches their lives. I think the challenge is that the United States Constitution expressly forbids a religious test or office. But the corollary of that is that the United States is not a theocracy. People are not given positions of trust in our government in order to impose their religious views on millions and millions of Americans without their consent. But the fact is, we see already in communications by the right wing about this nomination that they believe she will rule in their favor on these religious issues. They probably are not wrong, given that we've seen of her statements in the record. But I think the broader issue is, I think you're going to be put on our highest court. You ought to be someone who's not just young and smart and a right-wing advocate, but someone who has a lengthy record of willingness to set aside personal views in order to follow the law and to administer the law fairly for all. And Bill Moyers then says, but if you're sitting there with the President of the United States, if you're informed and knowledgeable and aware, you know this is the man who told the nation that COVID-19 was a hoax, even as he was saying to Woodward it was deadly stuff. And if he's giving you the bull about why you should be on the court, I don't want to be unfair to her, but because she has spoken openly and honestly, I think, about her faith, she has presented us with questions like this. What's happening in our country is not all Donald Trump. He is being enabled. Look at the people who have surrounded him at the moment to enable her nomination. She's enabling him by accepting it under these circumstances. And so it raises questions as how do we stop such things if so many participate in them and benefit from them? And Lisa Graves says, I don't know if I would call it, the conundrum. But it's one of the very uncomfortable circumstances of both this administration's approach to the law and the news cycle and public policy, where it's so transactional that these two things can coexist. By transactional, you mean transactional in the sense that they have a meeting at the Rose Garden that's all love about this nomination and its greatness that exists separate from the president's statements in which he says he wants this nomination in order to basically take the election by legal force, by judicial fiat, which exists in the context of a president who, I think it was only 2 weeks ago that the story broke that he knew exactly how contagious this disease was, how deadly it was months and months ago, and that he deliberately downplayed it to the American people and deceived them. And so all of these things are happening as if they're separate things, like that Rose Garden ceremony of introducing her happens as if there's this normalcy. We're in a normal presidency. This is a normal America. This is all just business as usual to have this ceremonial embrace of this nominee and this nomination as being something that's about the rule of law in America and is exalting the law. When outside of the Rose Garden, you have a scenario in which you have a president that has thumbed his nose at the law, who has violated the law in a number of ways that have been documented, and who has attacked the integrity of our very democracy and has impugned the integrity of the Supreme Court by how he has described the judges who have been put on it as, quote, his judges, unquote, and has described why he wants this judge confirmed to it to rule in his favor. And so the people who are joining with him in these different endeavors, it's as if they're able to put on blinders and ignore the reality, the full record of what's transpiring before our eyes, which is an assault on the rule of law, an assault on our actual Constitution, an assault on our very institutions, both in the executive branch, at the Justice Department, and other agencies. The way they've been so distorted and grotesquely distorted by partisan right-wing people who Trump has put in power, who have distorted health policy that has resulted in the death of hundreds of thousands of Americans and the infection of millions of Americans due to the fundamentally immoral actions by this president and by the people he has put in place to distort public opinion, to distort the record about a deadly disease. It's extraordinary to have the Senate and Mitch McConnell and these Judicial Crisis Network people supporting her, the ones that are running ads and supporting her at that White House ceremony, announcing her to be acting as if this is just a normal transition of the Supreme Court, when in fact it's a capture of the Supreme Court and a further deployment of the Supreme Court as a weapon for the far right to use to impose its narrow views on the rest of America and to destroy the core regulation of businesses in this country, including businesses that have harmed our climate. It is extraordinary to me that these things all seem to happen in these silos from the standpoint of coverage, when in fact they're inseparable. And the assault on the Supreme Court, this effort to capture it and move it as far to the right as possible for 10, 20, 30, possibly 40 years, and to do it in defiance of the American people's desire to have a fair say, is also grotesque. It's another manifestation of the dysfunction of our democracy. It's not just the president. It's that he has a number of enablers in the administration and outside the administration that are willing to turn a blind eye to almost everything he does in order to advance a very narrow and aggressive agenda. Bill Moore says it's clear that Chief Justice Roberts wants people to think that the Supreme Court is a non-political institution, that it's not beholden to the Republican Party. But with this new nomination, likely confirmation, it's going to become just the opposite, beholden to the Trump presidency and to the Republican Party. And Lisa says, I think that's right. If Coney Barrett is confirmed to the Supreme Court, it will cast a cloud over every decision that she makes. Every decision that this court makes, that this court has been manipulated, has been captured, is designed to be unfair, is designed to put the thumb of the far right and the corporate right wing on decisions of this court. And that fundamentally undermines, the idea of an independent court, what is happening to it right now. Bill Moyer says, Lisa Graves, thank you very much. And Lisa Graves says, thank you. And that's the end. I'm sorry I took so long to take you through that, but I really think that is a tremendously important piece of work. The way Lisa Graves tied everything together and related the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to a 40-year campaign to establish corporate control of the United States and to turn the clock back on so many things, on so many items. It is just incredible. And we now see it. We now see it all related to each other. That is very, very important, or related to everything else, that is going on, and even to the stimulus bill, This is a culmination of a 40-year effort. Do the Republicans consider relief for the American people in the middle of this crisis more important than culminating their 40-year effort with a seizure of the Supreme Court? I doubt that they do. Therefore, what I think is that they will choose to seize the Supreme Court by nominating Amy Coney Barrett and by not doing the stimulus bill. And I think they should be rejected by the country in the strongest terms for doing this in the weeks that remain of the election effort. Enough people must be gotten into the Senate and must be gotten into the House. And of course, Joe Biden must be gotten into the presidency so that an effort can be launched to immediately take back the court with 6 more justices, 6 new justices, all appointed during the Biden administration, during those 4 years, to redress the balance. Because the only way you will have a fair court is to redress the balance. Unless you want to remove the partisan justices. You can go in and you can impeach Thomas, and Alito, and Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh, because they're obviously all partisan justices, not necessarily partisan for one party or the other, but partisan for corporations, for the corporates, and for turning the clock back That's what they're partisan for. And Amy Coney Barrett would be another one. Now, Roberts sometimes has swung from one side over to the other in what seems to be some sort of attempt to occasionally be fair. So maybe Roberts should be exempted from all this. I mean, maybe in a fair court and surrounded by a fair court, he could become a fair judge, even though obviously he's always going to be a little pro-corporate. But maybe he could turn into a judge who relied on precedent, on changing with the times, and on just being reasonable from time to time, having a reasonable respect for what the legislature does. But if you're not willing to impeach Thomas, Alito, and Gorsuch, and Kavanaugh, and Amy Coney Barrett, if she is confirmed for partisanship, you will never have a fair court unless you pack it with 6 justices that have agendas on the progressive side of the ledger, so that there is a 9-6 majority in favor of legislation that would be progressive and that would allow America to meet the challenges that we all face. So that's it. I don't have, I'll go through your comments now. Okay, as usual, here we go. I hope you liked that. I know, okay, I took a lot of time to do it. And Rick Maynard says 2. K. Paul McGuire says but 2 a.m., but it's weekend in the UK. And Rick Maynard says froze. Oh. Steve Wolfman says, this show has it all. Evil twins, more Steves than you can mention, nice people like Kay and Bonnie. It comes highly recommended. Kay says, thank you, Steve. Kay says, shared. And Carmen Muniz says, Dr. Love. Carmen Muniz says, got my almonds ready, nervous snacker. And Rick Maynard says, I was in them meetings here in New Hampshire. Told them to get off their ass and impeach if that's the only tool that can stop them. MSNBC is cut. But 90 tiny hands off at his Cheeto-Lini White House rally today. But laugh my ass off. MSNBC cut Donnie tiny hands off at his Cheeto-Lini White House rally today. That's quite a comment, Carmen. Laugh my ass off. And Carmen says hands. Correction. Steve says welcome. Carmen says, I read, but DT wants more than $1,200 per person. Well, maybe he does. I mean, maybe Pelosi should suggest to him $4,800 per person. See if he goes for it. That would do something for the American people. It would only cost $1.6 trillion also. And Rick Maynard says, the Trump cares about signing his name to checks. Give him his name. That's all right. Everybody will know. Everybody will know that the only way this got passed was through Pelosi and the Democrats as well. Carmen says, Pelosi blew me out of the water with Trump just wants his signature on the checks. People are hurting. They're not going to look at his signature. They're going to be too busy cashing it with their own signature. I'd love a debit card instead. Everybody would love a debit card. But the problem is Trump can't put his signature on the debit card. And Kay says, I can't see any of it happening. And Steve says, Doc, I see a lot of violence coming. What do you see? I think there's a very good chance for violence. I mean, with, his raising the army of poll watchers who are going to come in and open carry states with guns, and the people who are working the elections are supposed to call a phone number in order to defend against this, they're supposed to call a phone number. Somehow, I don't know if that's going to work. Okay, but of course, there are only 50,000 of them. And so they can't go to all the polling places in the United States. They can't even go to all the blue polling places in the United States. So where will they go? It's not clear. It probably depends on what kind of police presence will be involved and whether the police will enforce the laws or not. Carmen says 30 Republican senators don't want COVID either. Carmen says, and McConnell's always been an obstructionist. Why do people keep voting for him? Kay says Kentucky is a corrupt GOP state, always has been, but that doesn't explain it. Doesn't explain why they keep voting for him. The polls constantly show that he's not popular and that people would like to vote for someone else. But then Chuck Schumer comes along and doesn't allow a nominee to arise from the state itself. Instead, he selects Amy McGrath because she's an Air Force veteran. And he helps her get $40 or $50 million, okay, in a war chest. And she narrowly beats Charlie Booker as a result. And so she has a nomination. And she's nowhere when it comes to running a campaign and fighting Mitch McConnell. She's not offering any kinds of alternatives, okay, that people like. I mean, she's running on basically a centrist type no policy campaign. She started out the campaign saying she liked Trump. She's not saying that anymore, I guess, but that was really ridiculous. At first, people thought she was going to be a progressive. She came in with a reputation as a progressive. She soon announced that she liked Trump, some progressive. And Rick Maynard says, having internet trouble, take care, or I have to rebuild my office and computer layout. Sorry, Rick. And Cover Unit says, all the almonds are gone already. Kay says, I miss Moyers. I used to follow him all the time. Yeah, I miss him too. But he got too old. He didn't want to spend all that time. I don't blame him. Yeah, maybe he should get to live stream, like I do. I mean, I'm not sure how old Bill Moyers is. I may be older than Bill Moyers. Anyway, Carmen says, oh, crap. Reading Adolf Twitler is coming to Sanford, Florida to do a rally. That's Klan country up there. Oh, well. I hope he spreads COVID among the Klan. Kay says, I was thinking that, Carmen. No, I don't mean you were thinking that, Kay. And Carmen says, Herr Fuhrer is still scrambling to push through the drug card for seniors. I know. I think he'll give that up, though. If he can persuade Nancy Pelosi to give people stimulus checks that are twice as large or 3 times as large, he'll probably forget about the drug card for seniors. Because seniors are going to get that money also. I mean, why do something for some special group, when you can do it for everybody? And besides, it's only 200. It's not 1,200 or 2,400. And Barbara Wernick says that the Dems will act as if they have no power and allow this to go through. It's all obscene. Carmen says, yeah, they're not much better. Kay says, Carmen, I heard he was trying to steal the money for that drug card. He's trying to steal it from the Medicare Trust Fund, but of course, there's no money in the Medicare Trust Fund to steal. They're just pretending that they're taking it from a pile of money that actually exists. They're taking it from an accounting record. They don't have to change the accounting record if they don't want to. I mean, they don't have to change the accounting record. I mean, they can just issue the $200. That's all. Carmen says, yeah, how does one steal from Medicare when the federal government is monetarily sovereign? How does one steal money from Medicare when Medicare has no money? There's no money in the frickin' trust fund. There's just electronic bits of information that are not money because they're not in a bank account. Kay says, wonder where Eveline is tonight. I don't know. I invited her. Carmen says, plucking news feathers. And Kay says, they do it all the time. And Carmen says, do what? Kay says, steal from social programs. And Carmen says, for themselves. Sorta. He wants those cards to buy dumb seniors votes. And Carmen says, yeah, to say them back to Covida. Kay says, buying votes is illegal too. Carmen says, to sway them back to Covida. Carmen says, but he's doing it indirectly. Can't say he's buying votes outright. That kind of buying votes is not prohibited anyway, I'm afraid, folks. Kay says, that would not bust him anyway. Carmen says, the Puerto Rican governor is endorsing Trump. She actually looks like Trump in drag, too. The Puerto Rican governor is an appointee of Donald Trump. She has to endorse him. He appointed her. Carmen says, I bet a DT is going to try to pardon himself. Yes, he'll try. He'll try anything. His formula is, I'll try anything. Let's see them stop me. If we don't stop him, he'll try anything. That's his formula for success. I'll do everything till they stop me. Carmen Muniz says, I bet the people there have been shamefully exploited. Carmen says, himself, sorry. Kay says, yes, they have. Kay says, PR wants to be their own country and not a U.S. territory. I don't know. Give them the right. In other words, let's have a plebiscite. Let the Puerto Ricans make a decision. And let them choose if they want to become a state or if they want to be independent. It's okay by me. Deborah Wilson says, I understand the actual issues that affect everyday Americans have to do with the worker rights versus the corporations. And Kay says, no, they don't. Okay, the U.S. wants to make them a state. And Rebecca says, H.R. 4901 would give Puerto Rico statehood. Yes. And Carmen Muniz says, which boils down to enslavement to the markets. It could boil down to just that. Kay says, yes, Rebecca, but they don't want it. Carmen says, I heard the opposite. We won't know until they vote. Many Puerto Rico residents do not want that. Puerto Rico, not Congress, must determine its future. Our bill enables it to do so. Understandably, many of our Democratic friends want to make the territory a state, to empower it, to get 2 more senators. But many Puerto Ricans view that push as the culmination of colonization. Yeah, I know they do. And Kay says, I have followed David Benyard. David Benyard. And he lived there for years, and the people have told him differently. And Carmen Muniz says that Trump Shire doesn't keep, Trump sure doesn't keep his intentions secret. Kay says, she's from Indiana too, a state totally ruined by Pence. Barbara Wernick said, this is not rocket science. The money people killed the JFK, and they have manipulated us all since. Okay, the deep state, they would never fool the people again. They had to destroy him. He would never lose, and they knew it. They crushed him and then his brother. And don't forget Martin Luther King. We were doomed from then on. Kay says, we would have had a greener economy years ago with Gore, although I did not like his churchy side. I think that Gore's wife, otherwise known as Tripper, was more churchy than Gore. Carmen Muniz says, but neoliberalism kills. And Kay says, yes, Elisa Graves is a great source. Carmen says, I just hope the aliens hurry up and land. Carmen says, somebody is biased. And Carmen says, great breakdown by Lisa Graves. Yes, it was a great breakdown. Carmen says, they're biased and need to be recused. And Biden says, and Kay says Biden won't commit to that because he's still courting GOP votes. Shake my head. I know. Carmen says, and that Barrett's judgments will lean to the religious oppressive side. Scares me to death. Me too. And Carmen says, great down by Lisa Graves. Just wow. It was something, wasn't it? And Carmen says, so McGrath is just a pawn to keep the status quo that both corporate-owned parties are upholding over liberty, democracy for, quote, we the people, a.k.a., quote, convenient wage slaves, unquote. Yes. Kay says, Rump wanted to go to Miami too, but the mayor said, hell no, laugh out loud. We'll see how that works. But laugh out now. Carmen Rena says, hi, Bonnie, love bug.
Hi.
And Carmen Rena says, I miss Bernie, sigh. Well, Bernie's out there campaigning. Okay, he had a virtual town hall today for Arizona. It was very good. Trying to get some votes, okay, in Arizona. Trying to keep the movement stoked up, but trying to get some votes for Joe Biden in Arizona as well. I should say more, trying to get votes against Donald Trump. Okay, friends, we've come to the end. I meant to have a longer discussion today, but that was such a great interview with Lisa Graves that I just had to give you the interview and comment on it. It was just so great. It's one of the best things I've seen in a long time, and I thought you should see it too. We should have it too. Carmen says, I don't want to see him campaign for the enemy. I don't want to see him campaign for the enemy also. But you have to understand, these are alliances. Right now, there's an alliance of convenience with Biden that we need to have. The day after the election, in fact, even before the day after the election, like now, we can start hassling Biden about Supreme Court expansion. We need to do that, actually, right now. Kay says, I've been following Bernie's rallies and town halls all across the country. Very good. I know you have, Kay. Carmen says, yes, I'm sharing that interview for sure. And Kay says, glad you did, Joe. Thank you, Kay. Okay, folks, I think we've come to the end. Carmen says, very true, Dr. Joe. Focus restored. Okay. Focus restored. Focus on Biden right now. We shouldn't cease criticisms of Biden. We should make the criticisms of Biden every day. But in making those criticisms, we should also be telling people why Donald Trump has to be defeated right now. And we should not vote to shame anybody either. We don't do that. People vote for who their conscience tells them to vote. That's the way it has to be. We're never going to vote a shame. But if we think that Trump has to be defeated at all costs, then we will also continue to critique Trump. And that's the way it should be. Now, whatever we say about Biden, we will be saying 10 times worse of Trump. Because Trump is the enemy of the moment. Biden can become the enemy right after he's declared the winner of the presidency. Right after that, he can be declared the new enemy of the progressive left, the real opposition that we have to defeat. On that note, I'm going to end this broadcast.